Narrator, slow, dramatic, rising tension. The battlefield doesn't forgive hesitation. It punishes those who move too slowly. And in the chaos of World War II, one army discovered this truth faster than anyone else. It was 1942, and the world was engulfed in a conflict unlike anything humanity had ever seen. Europe had already fallen under the shadow of the German war machine. Blitzkrieg tactics, fast, coordinated, devastating, had shattered traditional armies. In the Pacific, Japan had captured entire islands and territories with shocking efficiency, leaving Allied forces scrambling to respond. Amidst this chaos, the United States was just entering the war. It was a nation untested on the battlefield, yet brimming with industrial power and human potential. And yet, the U.S. military would prove something remarkable: the ability to adapt, to learn faster than any other Allied army, and to turn the brutal lessons of war into immediate, tangible advantages. Visuals: archival footage of U.S. soldiers boarding ships in 1942, factories producing tanks, planes taking off. Adaptation wasn't just about technology or firepower. It was about mindset. While other militaries relied on tradition, rigid hierarchies, and fixed strategies, American forces encouraged initiative, experimentation, and rapid learning. The U.S. soldier, sailor, and pilot were taught to think critically, to improvise when orders failed, and to use failures as a blueprint for improvement. Consider the context. By late 1942, German panzer divisions had already demonstrated unprecedented coordination across the European continent. Japanese forces had perfected night combat, ambush tactics, and rapid amphibious landings in the Pacific. Most Allied forces at the time were struggling to respond, bogged down by outdated doctrines and supply issues. The French army had fallen in 1940. The British Expeditionary Force had barely escaped at Dunkirk. Meanwhile, America was preparing to send millions of men overseas, many of whom had never seen battle. Visuals: maps of Europe 1940 to 42, German panzers rolling through France, Japanese soldiers landing on islands. The stakes were immense. Every delay, every mistake, could cost thousands of lives. And in such a high-pressure environment, the ability to learn faster than your opponent wasn't just an advantage, it was survival. American forces began their war effort with massive mobilization. Factories that once produced cars, tractors, and consumer goods were converted almost overnight to produce tanks, planes, artillery, and ammunition. Shipyards worked around the clock to deliver troop transports, landing crafts, and battleships. But raw production wasn't enough. Producing machines is one thing, using them effectively in a complex, dynamic war zone is another. Visuals: U.S. factories in full production, aircraft being assembled, ships being launched. The military recognized this early. Training programs were redesigned to teach soldiers not just how to follow orders, but how to adapt in unpredictable circumstances. Officers were encouraged to test new tactics in simulations and exercises before deploying them in combat zones. Feedback loops were rapid. Lessons learned in one theater were communicated immediately to units elsewhere, creating a constantly evolving operational strategy. At the same time, the U.S. military approached logistics differently from nearly every other nation involved in the war. While Germany still relied on horses to move supplies on the Eastern Front, and Japan struggled to transport goods across vast oceans, America invested in mobility, redundancy, and planning at an industrial scale. Trucks, fuel, spare parts, and mobile repair units were deployed systematically. Every failure, broken equipment, delayed supplies, or tactical misstep was recorded, analyzed, and used to prevent future issues. Visuals: U.S. supply trucks rolling through mud, engineers repairing tanks, pilots inspecting aircraft. But adaptation wasn't only mechanical, it was cultural. The American military valued initiative at all levels. A sergeant could make battlefield decisions without waiting for orders from higher command. A pilot could innovate in midair to evade enemy fighters. Mistakes weren't punished if they led to insights. Instead, they were studied and incorporated into future doctrine. This culture of rapid learning contrasted sharply with older, more rigid military traditions. By 1943, these efforts were bearing fruit. In North Africa, the U.S. Army faced veteran German troops under Rommel. Initial encounters were brutal. Soldiers were uncoordinated, tanks malfunctioned in the desert, and supply lines frequently broke down. But American forces adapted faster than anyone expected. Tank units learned to traverse desert terrain. Supply columns were reorganized for efficiency. Communication protocols were improved. By the time Operation Torch was launched, U.S. soldiers were no longer novices. They were evolving combatants, capable of learning from each failure and applying lessons in real time. Visuals: desert battles, tanks moving through sand, U.S. troops using radios. Simultaneously, in the Pacific, the U.S. Navy faced the deadly efficiency of the Japanese fleet. Early losses at places like Guadalcanal exposed weaknesses in reconnaissance, navigation, and carrier operations. Yet the Navy adapted quickly. Radar systems were optimized, amphibious assault techniques refined, and island-hopping campaigns meticulously planned to minimize casualties while maximizing strategic advantage. Visuals: aircraft carriers launching planes, soldiers landing on islands, radar rooms in operation. The lesson was clear: the speed of learning mattered as much as firepower. While other armies hesitated, waiting for orders from distant headquarters, American units improvised, experimented, and evolved their tactics on the fly. The U.S. military's culture, combined with unprecedented industrial capacity, allowed it to implement changes at a scale unmatched by any other Allied force. And the results spoke for themselves. By the time Allied forces prepared for the Normandy invasion in 1944, the U.S. Army had refined every tactic it had learned, from desert warfare to jungle combat, and was capable of integrating new information faster than any opposing force. Every delay for the enemy became an advantage for the Americans. Every mistake they made became a stepping stone toward victory. Visuals: D-Day landings, soldiers moving through fortified beaches, medics treating casualties. It wasn't just bravery or numbers that won the war, it was adaptability. The U.S. military's ability to learn, evolve, and implement changes faster than any other Allied army became a force multiplier. It turned inexperience into innovation, chaos into opportunity, and mistakes into lessons that reshaped the battlefield. This is where the story begins: a nation untested in war, confronted by overwhelming challenges, and yet capable of learning faster than anyone else. This ability would not only define the U.S. military's role in World War II, but would also set a standard for modern warfare that endures to this day. Visuals: archival footage of U.S. troops preparing for battle, supply lines, aerial views of battlefields, and cinematic slow motion of soldiers marching. Narrator: slow, reflective, building tension. To understand why the American forces adapted faster than any other Allied army, we have to look beyond the battlefield. We must examine the context, the preparation, and the industrial and cultural foundations that allowed rapid evolution in the midst of chaos. By 1941, the United States had not yet officially entered World War II. The nation watched from across the Atlantic and Pacific, fully aware of the devastation spreading across Europe and Asia. Britain was holding on by a thread after the fall of France, and the Soviet Union was locked in a life-or-death struggle with the German Wehrmacht. Japan's aggressive expansion in Asia had left territories in flames and millions of civilians in peril. The United States, still grappling with the Great Depression, had the potential for enormous military power, but it was largely untapped. Visuals: archival footage of 1940s American cities, factories pre-war, newspapers with headlines of Europe and Japan. Despite its initial neutrality, America had already begun preparing behind the scenes. The Lend-Lease Act of March 1941 allowed the U.S. to supply allies with weapons, vehicles, and supplies. But supplying allies wasn't enough. The U.S. military had to prepare for combat itself. Training programs were expanded, doctrines reevaluated, and the military-industrial complex rapidly scaled up. The industrial might of the United States was unprecedented. Factories that once produced cars, tractors, and civilian machinery were converted into production lines for tanks, aircraft, artillery, and ammunition. Henry Ford's assembly lines, once known for building automobiles, were now building B-24 bombers at a pace that amazed even military planners. By 1942, the U.S. could produce more airplanes in a single month than Germany could produce in an entire year. Tanks, trucks, jeeps, and naval vessels rolled off assembly lines in staggering numbers. Visuals: B-roll of U.S. factories producing tanks and planes, assembly lines in motion, workers welding and assembling aircraft. Numbers alone, however, did not guarantee battlefield success. Early American troops were inexperienced. Soldiers, sailors, and pilots were learning to fight in unfamiliar environments: deserts, jungles, mountains, and islands. Many had never faced combat before. Early skirmishes in North Africa and the Pacific highlighted weaknesses in coordination, communication, and logistical planning. But American leadership recognized the value of learning from these failures. Unlike other nations entrenched in tradition, the U.S. military encouraged adaptation. Feedback loops were established, reports from the front lines were analyzed and transmitted to command centers, where lessons were immediately incorporated into training and strategy. A mistake on one battlefield could save lives on another. This rapid cycle of learning became a hallmark of American operations. Visuals: maps showing North Africa and the Pacific Islands, troops training, tactical meetings with maps and charts. Leadership also mattered. Commanders like General Dwight D. Eisenhower, General George S. Patton, and Admiral Chester W. Nimitz emphasized initiative, flexibility, and innovation. Patton's armored units in North Africa learned to coordinate tank movements across desert terrain, overcoming mechanical failures and supply shortages. Nimitz's Pacific Fleet adapted amphibious assault techniques, integrating intelligence, air support, and naval bombardment in ways the Japanese had never anticipated. Visuals: tanks moving across the desert, ships launching landing craft, officers planning with maps. Training played a critical role. American soldiers were not just drilled to follow orders, they were taught to think critically and improvise under pressure. Infantry units practiced combined arms maneuvers, integrating artillery, armor, and air support. Pilots trained in dogfighting, bombing, and reconnaissance adapted quickly to the realities of modern aerial combat. Each unit was encouraged to experiment, to report successes and failures, and to improve constantly. Equally important was logistics. Germany's Eastern Front was still heavily reliant on horses, with supply lines stretched across thousands of miles of frozen terrain. The Japanese, despite early successes, struggled with long supply chains across the Pacific. By contrast, America built a logistical system designed for mobility and redundancy. Trucks, jeeps, and mobile repair units allowed armies to move quickly while maintaining operational readiness. Fuel, ammunition, and spare parts were delivered efficiently, often faster than the enemy could respond. Visuals: American trucks moving through mud, soldiers refueling tanks, engineers repairing equipment. Technology was another force multiplier. U.S. forces integrated radar, sonar, and cryptography to outmaneuver the enemy. Intelligence gathering, from breaking codes to reconnaissance flights, allowed American commanders to anticipate enemy movements. The combination of technology, industrial power, and a culture of rapid adaptation gave U.S. forces a decisive advantage in every theater of war. Consider North Africa. In 1942, the inexperienced U.S. II Corps faced Rommel's seasoned Afrika Korps. Early encounters exposed flaws in coordination and desert warfare tactics. Yet, by applying lessons learned from each skirmish, improving supply chains, coordinating armor and infantry, and enhancing communications, the U.S. Army rapidly evolved. By the time Operation Torch began, American forces were no longer novices. They were learning combatants, capable of outmaneuvering experienced German units. Visuals: desert battles, tanks traversing sand dunes, maps showing troop movements. In the Pacific, the stakes were different but no less severe. Early encounters at Guadalcanal and the Solomons revealed weaknesses in amphibious landings, reconnaissance, and coordination between Army and Navy units. Yet, each failure was meticulously studied. Tactics were refined, intelligence improved, and subsequent operations became more precise and deadly. Island-hopping campaigns reduced casualties while capturing strategically vital locations. The combination of industrial scale, cultural flexibility, technological innovation, and adaptive leadership created an environment where American forces could absorb lessons faster than any other Allied army. Unlike nations bogged down by tradition or rigid doctrine, the United States turned experience, both success and failure, into immediate battlefield advantage. By mid-1943, the pattern was unmistakable. U.S. forces were no longer learning on the fly, they were setting the pace. Every theater of war, from the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of the Pacific and the beaches of Europe, showcased the speed, efficiency, and adaptability of the American military. Lessons learned were applied instantly, mistakes corrected, and strategies improved continuously. This foundation, industrial might, flexible culture, rapid learning, technological innovation, and adaptive leadership, set the stage for what would come next. In the battles to follow, American forces would prove that speed of adaptation could be just as decisive as tanks, planes, or artillery. The ability to absorb lessons, implement changes, and innovate faster than the enemy became the true hidden weapon of the United States. And as the war progressed, these qualities would not just allow U.S. forces to survive, they would allow them to dominate, to anticipate, and ultimately to turn the tide in favor of the Allies. In the next chapter, we will see exactly how this adaptability translated into battlefield success, from critical early engagements to pivotal. Narrator, slow, suspenseful, rising tension. By mid-1942, the American forces were no longer just observers in a global conflict. They were becoming active participants, facing a reality that would test every lesson, every preparation, and every ounce of adaptability they had cultivated. And nowhere was this more evident than on the battlefields of North Africa and the Pacific. The first true test came in the deserts of North Africa. Operation Torch, November 1942, marked the United States' large-scale entry into the European theater. For many American soldiers, this was their first exposure to modern mechanized warfare. They were inexperienced, untested, and faced a formidable enemy in the German Afrika Korps, led by the cunning Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Visuals: maps of North Africa, landing beaches, armored columns moving across desert terrain, archival photos of U.S. troops. Early skirmishes revealed glaring weaknesses. Convoys became easy targets for German panzers and Luftwaffe attacks. Supply chains stretched across hundreds of miles, with fuel and ammunition often delayed. Soldiers learned the harsh truth: desert warfare demanded improvisation, speed, and coordination unlike anything they had trained for back home. But the U.S. approach to adaptation was relentless. After every engagement, officers compiled detailed reports. Units shared first-hand accounts of mechanical failures, communication breakdowns, and tactical errors. Commanders analyzed these insights, adjusted strategies, and retrained soldiers for the next confrontation. Within weeks, American forces were no longer reacting blindly, they were anticipating Rommel's moves. Visuals: U.S. officers reviewing maps, soldiers practicing tank maneuvers, mechanics repairing vehicles under fire. One of the most dramatic examples was the Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943. Initially, American troops were overwhelmed by the experienced German forces. Communications failed, artillery was mismanaged, and inexperienced troops panicked under fire. The battle ended in a humiliating retreat, exposing vulnerabilities in American command structure and coordination. But here lies the turning point, the essence of adaptation. Military planners didn't ignore these failures, they studied them. Generals reorganized units, implemented combined arms tactics, and improved intelligence gathering. Lessons learned at Kasserine were applied in subsequent operations, transforming the American Army into a more cohesive and formidable force. Visuals, battle reenactments, U.S. troops regrouping, field commanders coordinating tanks and infantry. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the story was equally compelling. The Japanese had established a vast defensive network across the islands, with fortified positions, hidden bunkers, and rapid counterattack capabilities. American Marines faced the brutal reality of amphibious assaults against entrenched enemies. Guadalcanal, in August 1942, became a crucible of adaptation. Initially, Marines suffered heavy losses. Terrain was unfamiliar, tropical diseases ravaged troops, and supply lines were precarious. But American commanders quickly adapted. They implemented coordinated land, sea, and air strategies, using reconnaissance planes to identify enemy positions and adjusting landing tactics to minimize casualties. Every mistake became a lesson for the next assault. Visuals, Marines landing on beaches, aerial reconnaissance, artillery barrages hitting fortified positions, jungle warfare footage. The speed of adaptation was staggering. New equipment, such as flamethrowers and portable radios, were integrated into units almost immediately after field tests. Lessons from Guadalcanal informed operations in the Solomons and New Guinea, allowing U.S. forces to strike with precision and surprise, often outpacing Japanese defenses. Back in Europe, the American Army's adaptability became even more pronounced in Italy. Following the Sicilian campaign, Allied forces faced mountainous terrain, fortified German positions, and harsh winter conditions. American engineers and logisticians devised innovative solutions, building temporary roads, using mule trains for supply when vehicles couldn't traverse rocky passes, and implementing coordinated artillery barrages to support infantry advances. Visuals, U.S. troops climbing mountains, engineers constructing supply routes, artillery firing over ridges. The combination of learning from failure, improvising under pressure, and leveraging technological advantages defined American success. While German and Japanese forces often relied on rigid doctrines or outdated assumptions, U.S. forces continuously evolved. They created mobile repair units, established forward supply depots, and developed contingency plans for every possible battlefield scenario. Perhaps the most dramatic illustration of American adaptability came during the Normandy invasion, D-Day, June 6, 1944. Planning for Operation Overlord was unprecedented in scale and complexity. Every variable, from tides and weather to enemy fortifications, was analyzed. Training exercises in England simulated every possible obstacle. Yet, even on D-Day itself, unexpected challenges arose: stronger German resistance, flooded fields, and mislanded troops. American forces responded with improvisation. Units reorganized on the fly, utilized portable bridges to cross obstacles, and established forward medical and supply stations under fire. Even when chaos struck, communication protocols allowed commanders to adjust strategies in real time. The adaptability that had been honed over years in North Africa, Italy, and the Pacific paid off, saving countless lives and securing key beachheads. Visuals, landing crafts approaching beaches, soldiers under fire, medics assisting wounded, makeshift bridges being. At every stage, the pattern was unmistakable. Americans could fail, learn, and improve faster than any other Allied army. They embraced innovation while maintaining discipline, combining tactical flexibility with logistical efficiency. Whereas the German Wehrmacht struggled with overstretched supply lines and the Japanese faced resource shortages, American forces leveraged industrial production, technology, and rapid feedback loops to dominate every theater. By the end of 1944, the consequences of this adaptability were clear. American divisions moved faster, struck harder, and recovered quicker from setbacks than any opponent. Every misstep became a lesson, every victory a blueprint for the next engagement. The U.S. military's ability to absorb information, adjust tactics, and innovate under pressure became a decisive factor in turning the tide of World War II. Visuals, U.S. forces advancing in France, Pacific Island landings, supply trucks moving across Europe, engineers repairing roads and bridges. Narrator, dramatic, reflective. The battles of North Africa, the Pacific, and Europe were more than tests of strength, they were tests of adaptability. And in every instance, the Americans proved that learning faster than the enemy could be as powerful as tanks, artillery, or planes. The speed of thought, of adaptation, and of execution became their secret weapon. And yet, as victories accumulated, the true shock remained. The enemy had never faced an opponent that could learn so quickly. The consequences of this capability would become even more apparent as the Allies moved closer to Germany and Japan, where adaptability would mean the difference between victory and annihilation. Visuals. Montage of American forces celebrating victories, training new units, planning operations, and advancing across diverse terrains. Narrator, slow, suspenseful, dramatic. By late 1944, the world believed victory in Europe was within the Allies' grasp. Yet, beneath the surface, a hidden challenge was brewing, a twist in the war that would test everything the American forces had learned. It was a revelation that would expose not just the enemy's weakness, but the strategic brilliance and adaptability of the U.S. military in ways few had anticipated. The twist began quietly, far from the front lines. American commanders noticed unusual patterns in intelligence reports. German units, once capable of rapid counterattacks, were faltering, not because of casualties, but because their supply lines were collapsing. Entire divisions could no longer transport fuel, artillery, or food efficiently. Visuals. Frozen roads with abandoned German wagons, empty fields, maps showing disrupted supply routes. At first, some Allied officers underestimated the significance. The Wehrmacht still had tanks, still had artillery, and still had experienced soldiers. But the American analysts saw the bigger picture. Logistics was failing. Horse-drawn supply wagons, overworked and underfed, were breaking down in unprecedented numbers. German mobility, a critical advantage in previous campaigns, was crumbling under its own weight. The U.S. response was immediate. Logistic planners exploited this weakness ruthlessly. Convoys of trucks moved swiftly across France, carrying fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements. American engineers repaired roads and bridges at record speed, ensuring uninterrupted advances. Tanks and artillery, previously slowed by terrain, now moved with astonishing efficiency. Visuals. American truck convoys racing through mud, engineers repairing bridges, Sherman tanks rolling over newly paved roads. The shock for the Germans came when they realized that speed was no longer just an advantage, it was a weapon. Entire defensive lines were being bypassed, rendering entrenched positions irrelevant. For the first time in the war, U.S. forces were operating with strategic mobility that German commanders could neither anticipate nor counter. In the Pacific, a similar twist emerged. Japanese forces, believing they controlled key islands through fortified bunkers and hidden artillery, were blindsided by the speed of American amphibious assaults. Intelligence gathering had become so efficient that U.S. forces could strike where and when the enemy least expected. Entire garrisons were isolated, cut off from reinforcements, and overwhelmed before they could respond. Visuals. Amphibious landings, Marines using flamethrowers and artillery, isolated Japanese troops on islands. The true genius of this moment lay not in brute force, but in adaptability. American commanders adjusted plans in real time. When unexpected resistance arose, troops improvised new tactics. Engineers and medics moved with unparalleled speed to maintain operational momentum. Each failure was analyzed, corrected, and turned into a blueprint for the next operation. Yet, the most shocking twist was psychological. German soldiers and commanders were demoralized not by losses in battle alone, but by the relentless pace of the American advance. A single division could be outmaneuvered by a handful of trucks carrying fuel and ammunition. Entire strategies were rendered obsolete overnight. Visuals. German soldiers retreating, abandoned artillery, American columns advancing rapidly. By early 1945, This logistical and tactical advantage became catastrophic for Germany. Cities and fortresses that were considered impregnable fell rapidly. The famous speed versus tradition gap was no longer theoretical, it was decisive. The American Army's ability to adapt, learn from each encounter, and innovate faster than any other Allied force ensured that Germany could not recover. Across the Atlantic, the Lend-Lease program added another layer to this twist. Trucks, jeeps, and fuel sent to the Soviet Union allowed Red Army units to operate at speeds previously unimaginable. German forces found themselves outpaced on two fronts simultaneously. Logistics, the lifeblood of any army, was no longer under their control. Visuals: Soviet trucks rolling into battle, American logistics hubs, maps showing dual front pressure on Germany. The consequences were profound. Entire panzer divisions, equipped with advanced tanks and artillery, were rendered immobile due to supply shortages. German infantry, often starving and exhausted, struggled to maintain positions. Meanwhile, American units advanced relentlessly, using speed and coordination as weapons in themselves. It was a lesson in modern warfare. The side that could adapt fastest, think fastest, and move fastest would dominate the battlefield. This twist revealed a harsh truth for historians and military analysts alike. It wasn't just firepower or numbers that determined victory, it was the ability to innovate under pressure and exploit every weakness, no matter how subtle. Visuals: tactical maps, American officers planning, trucks and tanks moving in perfect coordination. The ripple effects were staggering. German supply failures led to catastrophic defeats at the Rhine and across Western Europe. Fortifications meant to slow the Allied advance crumbled under the weight of well-supplied and highly mobile American forces. The German army, once feared for its engineering prowess and tactical brilliance, now faced a foe that could outthink, outpace, and outmaneuver them at every turn. The American twist was not merely a battlefield advantage, it was systemic. Every engagement, from desert skirmishes to island invasions, had trained troops and commanders to respond to unpredictability. By the time Allied forces approached the heart of Germany, they were operating as a single, adaptive machine, learning and improving with every passing day. Visuals: Allied forces crossing rivers, repairing destroyed roads, coordinating tanks, infantry, and air support. Even in the Pacific, Japanese forces discovered the same shocking reality: mobility, adaptability, and logistics had become more lethal than sheer firepower. By anticipating enemy behavior, optimizing supply chains, and continuously innovating tactics, American forces could strike with surgical precision. Entire garrisons were isolated, reinforcing the idea that speed and adaptability, not sheer numbers, decided the outcome. Narrator: dramatic, reflective pause. The twist of the war was subtle, yet devastating. It wasn't a new weapon, nor a miraculous strategy, nor a single heroic act. It was the relentless, methodical, and unmatched ability of American forces to adapt faster than any other army on the planet. And as the final months of the conflict unfolded, that very advantage would decide the fate of nations. By the time Germany faced unconditional surrender, the outcome was already determined, not just by Allied numbers, but by the cumulative effect of innovation, learning, and adaptability. Every failure, every setback, every unexpected challenge had been turned into an advantage, a lesson, a weapon. Visuals: Allied troops marching through liberated towns, Americans celebrating victories, German soldiers surrendering, tanks and trucks advancing. The world would later study this twist in awe. The Americans hadn't simply fought, they had outthought, outpaced, and outadapted every adversary. And in doing so, they created a paradigm shift in modern warfare. Adaptability, speed, and logistics were just as critical as courage, firepower, or strategy. Visuals: slow-motion montage of American military success, maps showing rapid advances, archival footage of adaptive tactics in battle. Narrator: slow, reflective, dramatic. As the smoke cleared over Europe and the Pacific, the full scale of the American advantage became undeniable. Tanks, planes, and infantry had all played their part, but it wasn't just the hardware that won the day. It was the invisible weapon, speed, adaptability, and relentless logistical genius that no other army could match. By mid-1945, German forces lay in ruins, surrendering to an enemy they could neither predict nor outmaneuver. The same story echoed across the Pacific, where Japanese islands fell one by one, not due to overwhelming firepower alone, but because U.S. forces could move faster, strike harder, and adapt instantly. Entire campaigns collapsed under the pressure of American mobility. Supply lines never faltered, reinforcements arrived without delay, and every battlefield decision was executed with ruthless efficiency. Visuals: American troops marching through liberated cities, planes taking off, supply trucks racing along dirt roads, Japanese islands being secured, maps showing rapid advances. The final twist, the ultimate revelation, lay in the realization that adaptability had been seeded long before the first shots were fired. U.S. military training, doctrine, and industrial strategy had created an army designed not to fight one kind of war, but to learn, adjust, and overcome anything thrown at it. Every battlefield challenge, logistics, terrain, weather, or enemy tactics became a test, and every test sharpened the Army's response. Even technology, advanced as it was, relied on human ingenuity to be effective. Trucks, radios, and amphibious landing craft were tools, but adaptability made them instruments of dominance. While Germany and Japan were slowed by rigid planning, bureaucratic chains, and outdated systems, the U.S. embraced fluidity, improvisation, and continuous learning. Commanders empowered lower ranks to make decisions. Engineers innovated on the fly. Logistics officers turned seemingly impossible supply problems into triumphs. Visuals: American engineers repairing bridges under fire, medics treating soldiers while advancing, tactical maps updating in real time, soldiers loading and unloading trucks efficiently. One historian later described it as the invisible blitzkrieg. Not a storm of tanks alone, but a whirlwind of strategy, supply, and adaptability that could strike faster than any enemy could react. Entire campaigns were won without a single decisive battle, just by moving faster, supplying better, and thinking smarter. In Europe, for instance, fuel shortages immobilized German panzer divisions. Entire artillery lines were abandoned in the snow. American truck convoys bypassed entrenched positions, refueled, resupplied, and advanced relentlessly. The enemy, despite numerical strength or superior firepower, simply could not match this pace. Visuals: German tanks stuck in mud, American convoys moving unhindered, aerial maps showing Allied rapid advances across Europe. In the Pacific, the twist was equally dramatic. Japanese defenders believed their islands secure, relying on bunkers, coastal guns, and hidden infantry. Yet U.S. forces, using rapid reconnaissance and mobile supply chains, landed at unexpected points, isolating units and forcing surrender. Adaptability turned the environment itself into a weapon against the enemy. Each island became a test, and the Americans consistently passed. Visuals: amphibious landings, Marines securing beachheads, aerial reconnaissance footage, supply drops in rugged terrain. The real shock came in hindsight. Scholars analyzing the war realized that speed, flexibility, and logistical genius outweighed traditional measurements of military might. A small number of American trucks, properly deployed, could do the work of thousands of horses. A single supply chain could sustain divisions while others starved, froze, or stalled. Entire victories were often achieved before the first shot was fired, simply by being faster, smarter, and better prepared. Visuals: comparison: German horse-drawn wagons versus American motorized convoys, tanks rolling, supply depots buzzing with activity. The Americans didn't merely fight, they learned, adapted, and exploited every flaw in their enemy's strategy. Logistics, often invisible to the naked eye, became the decisive weapon. Troops could advance without pause, artillery could be relocated instantly, and fuel could flow to where it was needed most. Battles were no longer just about numbers, terrain, or firepower. They were about who could outthink and outmove the other. Visuals: medics and engineers racing to repair vehicles, troops marching in coordinated formations, command centers analyzing real-time intelligence. And yet, despite these triumphs, there remained a haunting question, a historical cliffhanger. What if Germany or Japan had adapted faster? What if they had understood the lessons of mobility and modern logistics before the war spiraled out of control? Would the outcome have been different? This is the paradox of war. Innovation is not about having the biggest army, the deadliest weapons, or even the most brilliant generals. It is about anticipating change, responding to uncertainty, and evolving faster than the opponent. The U.S. forces demonstrated this principle repeatedly, moving faster, supplying smarter, and adapting continuously. Visuals: slow motion of American soldiers advancing, medics moving supplies, engineers fixing tanks, planes taking off into the dawn, maps illustrating rapid tactical shifts. Narrator: slow, echoing, reflective. The lesson of World War II is clear. Victory does not always belong to the strongest, the most numerous, or the most heavily armed. It belongs to those who adapt, innovate, and move faster than anyone else. In 1945, the United States proved that adaptability could be more powerful than firepower, foresight more decisive than numbers, and speed more lethal than strategy alone. The story does not end here. The strategies, lessons, and logistical frameworks pioneered during World War II shaped modern warfare forever. Mechanized armies, rapid deployment, real-time intelligence, and industrial-scale supply chains became the blueprint for every army that followed. The invisible weapon, the power to adapt faster than anyone else, would echo in every conflict to come. Visuals: archival footage of modern armies training, supply trucks rolling, helicopters taking off, modern tactical command centers, maps showing rapid troop movements. Narrator: dramatic, final, cinematic pause. When we study the battlefields of the past, remember this: courage, technology, or sheer numbers alone do not guarantee victory. Victory belongs to those who can move faster, think faster, and adapt faster. The armies that fail to evolve are doomed. The armies that embrace change, like the Americans, write history. Visuals: fade out with the American flag waving over a battlefield, montage of trucks, tanks, and troops advancing, ending with the words, "Adaptability wins wars."